Right, time to continue my series of videos on critiquing policies of specific presidents and time periods. Today, let's critique Andrew Jackson's. With noting, I'm gonna have finals soon, so I'm probably not gonna be making a video every day for the weekdays, but we'll see. I'll try my best. But let's run through Andrew Jackson's policies, specifically as president. So, number one, the most famous, Indian removal. Now, he's most known for this, but it was hardly a thing that he was doing alone. Am I going to sit back and support it? No, absolutely not. It was a horrible policy. Jackson supporting it was a bad idea. If you wanted to go the imperialist route, which I get, throughout America's history, expansion was a big part of it. A better solution would have just been saying, these are our subjects, we are not negotiating treaties with them, and so all treaties with them are null and void, their lands are now ours. Sure, scummy, but at least it's more straightforward than signing a treaty with the people, saying they're an independent entity, and then proceeding to violate said treaties and kick them off their own land. The more honest thing would have been, yeah, we're just going to annex you. You have no treaties with us because you're a subject. All our treaties are null, and now your lands are part of ours. Still really bad a policy in terms of, being nice to people you literally conquered. But at least it's direct and honest. And frankly, that's more respectful just on the basics. Second, for those who don't know, paid off the debt. Now, it should be noted, while I say he paid off the debt, it'd really be Congress, considering the fact that power of the purse is at least traditionally held by the legislative branch. Now, presidents, especially more recently after the Great Depression, have done a lot to basically move the power of the purse themselves by signing executive orders and saying, here's what the executive branch is going to do, which necessitates further spending. But for the most part, this was handled by the legislature. Still an accomplishment and still worth acknowledging. What's also worth acknowledging is we got back into debt almost immediately. Because, deficit spending. Basically how the US has operated for a long time, alongside most governments, honestly. Now here's an interesting one. The central bank. Now this one is more controversial for obvious reasons. What he did was the Bank of the United States, the National Bank, was supposed to have its charter renewed. Jackson vetoed it, so it went bust. And instead, he shuffled the United States' money into what were called pet banks. Smaller banks that weren't centralized, but still, they were banks. Banks are banks are banks. And so, this really depends on what you think of central banking. I myself, not as big an opponent of central banking as most people economically similar to me, but still, it's not exactly the thing that most US people tend to like. We Americans tend to not like government interference, except when beneficial. And when you look at central banking, questionable on occasion. I mean, 2008 wasn't exactly a good time. But still, it had its place, it had its purpose. Jackson disagreed. I must say I get it. Don't agree with Jackson on this as much, but I get it. And on to a bit more of an interesting one. The tariff issue. Now, Jackson signed a bill passed by Congress which massively raised tariffs. This was actually such a big deal, his own vice president, John C. Calhoun, straight up abandoned his office, fled back to South Carolina, and threatened to secede over this. He said, no, we are not accepting these tariffs. You can go shove it. South Carolina is going to secede. Sorry. Now, Jackson's response, for as much as I dislike the guy for this especially, I have to respect, because what Jackson did was he mobilized the military, sent it to the borders of South Carolina, and basically said, if you try it, we will crush you. Which, as a very big unionist, supported wholeheartedly. The tariffs were eventually amended, and South Carolina stopped being such a firebrand for about 2 minutes before they found something else to be angry at, as is the fire either way. And although Jackson did not do this himself, the Texas issue was heavily influenced by him. Texas was a state that wanted to join the Union. It was a country for a bit, defeated Santa Anna, got their independence from Mexico. Now, Jackson was actually a big proponent of annexation. The reason why Texas was eventually annexed was because we finally got another free state, so Texas was able to balance it out. Because a lot of the U.S. policy during this time was built on expansion and balance of power between the North and South, free and slave. Jackson did not care about balance at all and said, I want Texas. I want us to expand. We should expand. Congress did not like that idea, so Texas wasn't annexed until later under James K. Polk, someone who, by the way, was actually supported by Andrew Jackson. And so what you end up seeing is Texas basically trying to ask the U.S. to join again and again until eventually a new free state can be made. And so that's what they do. They make a free state, they allow Texas to join as a slave state. All things are resolved. Now, this, combined with other more minor policies of Jackson's, give him a bit of a mixed reputation. On one hand, he was a very strong centralizing figure at a time of very pro-states' rights, territories, and situations, which, when you're dealing with a situation like the US's was in the 1820s and 30s, is important. You do not expand from sea to shining sea without a strong government and military. Jackson's focus on that allowed the U.S. to do so. He basically set the groundwork that Polk would eventually follow through to lead to the U.S.'s expansion. The Indian Removal Act also set the pace for a lot of other things the U.S. would later do. Now, we can debate over and over about the merits of Indian removal. A lot of people say it was bad. Don't blame them. I'd argue that it was definitely a bad decision. But what really makes it important was how they did it. See, they still recognize the tribes as sovereign entities. In fact, what a lot of people say when it comes to it is like, oh, they kicked them out. They really did. And it wasn't as in like, oh, send them to another part of the country. No, they carved out their own special territory for the Indians. It was called the Indian Territory. And in that territory, they were considered sovereign. The Cherokee ruled their territories, and also I misspelled Indian. The Cherokee ruled their territories, so did the Seminoles, so did the Choctaw, so on and so forth. And during that rule, they were sovereign, in a vague sense of the word. They were basically just puppets of the U.S., but still. They held territory, but the specific nature of it was that if you were on this side of the Mississippi River, you were sent west and into Oklahoma. Well, what is now Oklahoma? Where the Indian Territory was. And so the entire basis of it was the idea of segregation. If the Indians and the Americans, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, were close to each other, they would fight, kill each other, it wouldn't be good. So we gotta separate them, send them over there, so that we don't fight, and that they can keep their traditions intact. Now, one can see the argument for it. It's a garbage argument, in my opinion, but you can see the belief there of essentially, if these people stay where they are either going to get crushed or assimilated, so send them over there, conveniently letting us take their land, which, let's face it, was probably a bigger priority for a lot of the senators, and they can keep doing their own thing over there. I'll be honest, because Indian removal is the usual thing people focus on with Jackson's policies, they tend to neglect a lot of other things, because paying off the debt, not a bad thing. If I remember correctly, he also tried to implement a law saying you had to pay for land that you were buying out west with gold and silver. I could be misremembering that. It's been a bit since I've had AP US history, but I distinctly remember the gold and silver one, so I'll put it as a 6 with an asterisk. But it was a good way of basically paying off a lot of debt very quickly, because remember, this is the time of the gold standard for a lot of countries. Even when you have the US dollar, it's backed by gold. And so when you ask for specie, gold, for land, it allows for the rapid paying off of debt because, well, everyone works in gold. And remember, most of the debt is held by foreign countries, so you gotta export it, and they're not just gonna accept your paper money usually. So by paying in gold, more reliable. Though without question, his policies, through a number of pieces of it, one, his very heavy-handed way of handling things, but also his constant support for the South, strengthened the Southern planters quite substantially. The only reason the South had as much power as it did in the 1860s was because of Jackson. If we saw a more northern president, a Whig, for example, as they later formed against Jackson, or someone else like, say, John Quincy Adams, it'll likely be a more strong North than what we had even in our own timeline, where the North was already pretty strong in the 1860s. Jackson helped the South a lot with his policies because his heavy focus on strengthening the South through expansion, not only with the Cherokee but also in Florida, because if you don't know, there was actually a war going on between the Seminoles and the United States, which ended in their defeat and subsequent transfer to Indian Territory. A lot of Jackson's actions strengthened the southern U.S. Polk would do it too, though he seemed to more just want a complete manifest destiny. It wasn't as if he was actively supporting only the South. He still had a lot of Southern interests, but it was more just a general keep expanding mentality rather than for the South and the South alone. Otherwise, you would see him not annexing Oregon. But I'm getting back to Polk again, not Jackson. And so generally, when you look at Jackson's policies, on one hand, he was a strong leader that helped us deal with a lot of things. On the other, freaking horrible policies that strengthened the people who, by their nature, were not very loyal to the U.S. They had their own particular view, which involved them making as much money for themselves as possible with as much land as possible. The Southern planters were not exactly a group you wanted to strengthen, and yet Jackson did. In the end, Jackson had his ups and downs. Generally a negative president, in my opinion, largely due to this. But also, this didn't help either. So while we can certainly appreciate some of Jackson's contributions, we can also acknowledge flatly that he was not the best president. Not by a long shot. I'll leave you off with this. On one hand, $20 bill. On the other hand, he probably spent more than that just conquering even parts of Georgia. Have a good one.